John Barclay, and welcome to the Fatality Free Future podcast.
My name is Holly Ferguson. This is the podcast where we explore the challenges and possibilities to create a fatality-free future. In the last episode, we were speaking about critical risk management. Today, we brought Alan Stevenson back to discuss critical controls. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you. Yeah, good to be back.
Good to have you back.
Critical controls are where things can get a little bit blurry in this process. So let's start with clarifying what is a critical control.
I can go to the Bible.
What Bible do you have? You've got some paper in here.
In the mining world, I love paper, yeah. So the ICMM, which is the International Council of Mining and Metals, have been around for quite a long time now, and they've defined a process for critical risk and critical control management that's been adopted very widely across particularly the mining industry. So they have this good practice guide. So they've got a couple of publications. So anyway, in this good practice guide, it tries to create some distinction between control and critical control. And I'll just read what the ICMM term as a control. A control is an act, object, engineered, or system, which is a combination of act and object, intended to prevent or mitigate an unwanted event. An unwanted event. Critical control, a control that is crucial to preventing the event or mitigating the consequences of the event. The absence or failure of a critical control would significantly increase the risk despite the existence of the other controls. In addition, a control that prevents more than one unwanted event or mitigates more than one consequence is normally classified as critical. And that points to the current Workplace Health and Safety Act and the regulations around mining. And they talk about principal mining hazards. Principal mining hazards is something that has a major unwanted event or multiple fatalities is really what they're looking for. So that's the correlation to principal mining hazard. So it still seems a little bit not too distinct between a control or a critical control, but the critical control definition hangs on if that control is absent, then there is a serious likelihood, it's a realistic possibility that there'll be a fatality or multiple fatality or serious injury. So that's where that distinction comes in. The other controls might prevent someone nicking their hand or nicking their finger or having a sprain or something like that. So that's that level of control. So I think it's based on the situation. They have a process that they run you through, identifying the major unwanted events. From that, you then identify controls, and then from that, you distill down of all the controls that we've identified, which ones do we say are critical, that if it wasn't there, it increases the likelihood of a major unwanted event.
So from your perspective then, Alan, and I guess from the experiences we've had when we go out in the field, yes, we can look at the definitions and the distinctions and get into the technicalities of those descriptors. Why do you think it's really important that we actually have a distinction between a control and a critical control?
Probably, John, taking it back to the conversation we had in the last podcast, for me it's about, and I'm not a huge fan of risk matrices per se, but it's looking at, so if you go to the bow tie mechanism, it's the likelihood of that event happening and then the realistic consequences, right? So what's the likelihood of the event happening? So we know that serious injuries and fatalities, the likelihood is not as frequent as the smaller events, but we know that if the control or the controls that we're talking about aren't in place, like isolations, right? So isolations during shutdowns, during maintenance work, isolating pressure, electricity, all that kind of stuff. If those isolations are not in place and we let people loose on the equipment, realistically, we're going to have a serious injury or fatality.
That's an example where these things can get a bit blurry for people, especially around layers of controls and critical controls where, let's just use maintenance activities on plant. The isolations are definitely a critical control, right? Because without them being present, without them being done well, it still leaves a significant level of exposure and increases
Yep.
the likelihood and even the severity of something happening.
Yep.
While there still may be other controls in place, like
Yep.
might be having PPE on,
Yep.
or they might have their safe work method
Yep.
statement for the
Yep.
work and those sort of things. So it's not like there's not other controls in place, but when you look at all of that work and all the different controls they're using, you start to see one or two of them just become a lot more critical than the other ones do.
Definitely. And most critical control field verifications will have anything between 8 to 12, 13, what they identify as critical control. So they've gone through this process, and the ICMM has a process that if people step through it, then they will get to, and there's little flow charts, is it this, is it that, to help people get to a place of, well, that's a critical control, and that's a control, but it's not critical, but it's still useful to have. Right, for example, one of the organisations we're working for just now, they have a booklet with all their critical risks in it, right? And you look at the different levels, so isolations again, I think I used this as a recent example. You look at the page and the critical risk definition, and there's something like 32 bullet points.
Wow.
Right, so they've split it up into different sections, and there's 32 bullet points. You then go to their critical control field verification document form, and there's 13. So there's controls in their booklet. What's that? Roughly 20 controls in the booklet that may or may not be considered critical, but the controls which help to mitigate or help to reduce the likelihood and all of that kind of stuff. But when they're in the field and they're doing the verification, there's 13 that they've identified as critical. And then we get into how effective are they and all that conversation.
Yeah.
Everyone's got a different context and has different experience on site. So do you find that sometimes how we define what a critical control is can be based on our own biases?
Oh, yeah. And yes. So the short answer, I think, Holly, is yes. And that's where it's important, and the ICMM will stress through this, that's where it's important to have a diverse group of people in the conversation, because at the end of the day, someone is going to, and some of them are obvious, right?
Yeah.
Like isolations, locking out, depressurizing, all of that kind of stuff. Some of them are really obvious. But some of them may be not so obvious as a critical control. So having the right people in the room, so people who actually execute the work, people who supervise the work, people who plan the work, having that discussion around, and there's various flowcharts in this document, and BHP has been a big player in this space for a long time, so they have a process which is referred to. So just quickly from here, is control the only barrier? No. Is control effective for multiple risks? No. Is control independent? Yes. Critical control. Right, so there's various ways to help people facilitate. So you have consistency. So I think the other thing around this is consistency. So people can refer to something that helps them step through and make the distinction between, is that a control? Nice to have. Critical control, have to have.
Yeah. And I think that's the work that I think organisations don't always do as well as they should, right?
Yep.
And that's using a specific decision-making process with a collective group of people to come to a determination as an organisation, what are these critical controls that we're going to invest a lot more time, resource and effort in not only applying but verifying. Right? So it becomes a very strong focus. And right from the very first discussion around SIF prevention, it all comes about having a laser-like focus on the things that matter, not just try to look at everything. Yes, we want to try and address everything, and we get organisations' needs for that and people's intentions around trying to do that. But these are just another great example of, yes, we can have all these high-frequency, low-consequence events, but we want to hone in on what has the potential for SIF. So we go away and identify those, and then we identify controls, and we list a whole heap, like say 32 or 20, whatever it is. But then we've got to ask ourselves, well, yeah, we want all those in place, but what do we need to make sure we're extremely good at, and what do we need to make sure we have as little variation in as possible? And these are just great tools for people out there to use to really get their organisation aligned and in the same space around
Yep.
what these critical controls are. And
Exactly,
it might be 4, it might be 6, it might be 2. It's just understanding what are those things that are really critical.
Yep.
And try and remove the biases as your question started, Holly. As an individual, we may have a preconceived confirmation bias or frequency bias to certain controls, and I know when I go out in the field and coach leaders, the most obvious control they talk about more often than not is PPE, right? It's because it's obvious. It's very visual. It's very visible. And I think there's a perception that that's one thing that's really in the control of the person, really, is just wearing the right PPE.
Yep.
So you can see why they go there. But actually, if you go through this process, very few times would PPE, I'm not saying it's never, but very few times would PPE really be described as a critical control.
Yeah, it's usually a mitigation control. It's usually on the other side of the bow tie.
Correct.
Diagram. It's not before. Some of it is, like respiration and all that kind of stuff, but some of it isn't. So it can be. But I think the main thing, Holly, is there's the biases of, and then sometimes there's the bias of I've never heard of that happening before. I've never seen it happen before. And sometimes my experience in different industries is you have the experienced people, the long timers, who may have worked in a time when things were a bit Wild West, let's say, and they've learned about not having things in place, and for some people they've lost friends, they've lost colleagues. Those things happen, and those are the guys that I meet sometimes on site who get really anxious and upset and angry when. The greener people, the younger people coming in, and they're maybe not so familiar. They're just not experienced it, right? A classic, in the underground scenario is parking light vehicles in a particular way, right? So they have to park light vehicles in a particular way, even though they get handbrakes and gears and all the rest of it. That if all that failed and the light vehicle started rolling down an incline, it would gather speed and potentially kill someone, right? So there's controls. It's a critical control for parking light vehicles in an underground environment. And then there's some younger people who may think, well, I'll put the handbrake on, it's in gear.
What's more? Yeah.
But then there's people who have experience of going, let me tell you, when I was a lad, this happened and this vehicle ran downhill and it ran the driver over. He parked it up, he didn't park it properly. Next minute, he forgot to put the handbrake on, whatever it was. He's behind the truck started rolling and it's ran him over. And I've gone, really? I said, well, yeah. So parking a light vehicle in a particular way is a critical control to make sure that doesn't happen. So the biases are, well, I've seen it happen, I've heard of it happen. And then the younger people who think, it's only a couple of minutes. What's the problem?
Yep.
Well, you just never know. You just never know.
And I think that's always the interesting conversation in safety. And I think all our listeners could appreciate is everyone has a different experience, right? So I could be very experienced, been in the industry for 40 years, never had it happen. Never had it happen in the workplaces I'm at. I've probably heard of it happening in other locations or another industry.
Yeah.
But I have a very low perceived risk of it because it's never happened to me. It's never happened on the site I'm at. Yes, I've heard bits of it. So I have a very low versus a very experienced person that's seen it firsthand and has a very strong association with not only the risk but the control and applying the control. And then even the younger generation coming through, some are very, very risk averse. So they do see those things and pay very close attention to those risks. They're not comfortable with risk, so they're trying to apply everything that they can learn. Others may not be so much. Well, what do you mean? It's only this and it's only that, and I'm only doing it for 5 seconds and those sorts of things. We hear that a lot with trying to mitigate dropped objects. So, well, I've never dropped a spanner. And so, well, really? Like even in a workshop, even when you're working, like you've never dropped a and then had it hit the floor. Well, Well, that's no different when you're working at height. So there are some people that just don't have that level of association to risk. And I think that's half the challenge in this. And that's why, as you say, these processes are really important to do as a collective to really try and mitigate some of those biases.
And they don't normally share those experiences very, very well. I'll never forget, it always pops into my head, this example. And I'm not making any judgment about what happened. It was a number of years ago. I don't think I'd been in Australia that long. And I can remember reading through the West Australian newspaper, and on page 3 or 4 or something it was, and it was down in the there was a little piece down in the bottom right-hand corner of this page, and it was about someone who was working for a mining company. It said in the report that the person who died was 56 years old, and they'd been killed working on an elevated work platform, scissor lift type thing, right?
Yeah.
So I'm reading this story and I'm thinking, wow, 56 years old. How long has that person been a fitter? Let's say around numbers 40 years. 40 years. So what happened? What happened? This person supposedly knows what they're doing. And again, I'm not making any judgment around it. I thought, how has that happened? From a bias point of view, what control or controls were missing that meant that individual got crushed when that piece of equipment, which was extended and came down? What was missing? What was going on? What was going on? So the bias piece can creep in, and you look through the Safe Work Australia statistics and their dashboard and all the rest of it, and we think, oh, it's young people that are getting injured and killed. And then you look at certain industries and you go, well, actually, no. It's the 40, 50, 60-year-olds that are...
That's always been an interesting conversation we have sometimes in whatever workshops we're facilitating around either risk management or even just safety leadership in general. Just the general assumption that it is the generally 18 to 28 bracket that mainly has fatality. Look, don't get us wrong, there's a lot of fatalities happening in that age group, but actually most of it's over 45. And again, I'm a bit the same. So why is that? Right? Because we've got very experienced people who understand the work probably a lot better than anyone else. They're probably more familiar with the risks. I mean, I've probably had a couple of little close calls throughout their career. Probably shouldn't stick my hand there. I probably shouldn't do that. But yet, the fatality rates there are actually higher than any other age group. And again, I think it's trying to understand this bias part. I think people do get familiar with risks, and because nothing bad's happened, and this is the other conversation we get into around if we're judging safety, something being safe by the absence of harm.
Yes.
Actually create more unhelpful biases around the way we're doing work. And maybe then underplaying or creating perceptions of underestimating the importance of things like critical controls. With them being absent from time to time, nothing bad's happened, so maybe it's not critical. Maybe it's not that bad. And I think that's the other challenge we face in this environment is people do work, and sometimes that critical control was absent or not effective, and therefore then it reinforces a subconscious perception that that's actually probably not as critical as I thought.
And I think one of the episodes we had a bit of a conversation about normalization of deviance, right? So that's a bias situation. Well, it's okay, there's 13 controls on here, but we only need 12. Who was the bright spark that thought it was 13? We only need 12.
I'd actually like to ask you both about failing safely and how we can work that into this process as well.
So for me, the reference, and I'm not an expert in bow ties, but this ICMM process, Principal Mining Hazard Management Plans, most organisations will produce a bow tie to represent their critical risks and the controls. So the failing safely bit for me, when it's illustrated in a bow tie, will be on the right hand side. So you have your controls on the left hand side, that's where your critical controls will be. But then on the right hand side of the bow tie, there's the mitigative controls. So if something does happen, if we do, for whatever reason, lose control, then these mitigative controls, the PPE, that kind of thing, on the right hand side means that the likelihood of it being a serious injury or fatality is going to be minimized, right? So someone still might get hurt, but it's not going to be a serious injury fatality situation, actual near miss, whatever it is. So that's my relationship to the failing safely thing. It's not saying that we have all these controls in place, nothing's going to happen. It's not true. It's not a true statement because we don't know. We still have the human factor piece. But if it does fail, we know that if we have these controls on the right-hand side, then we're going to reduce the likelihood of it being a serious injury or fatality. So that's my view.
Yeah, and probably a similar experience for me. I mean, coming originally from the chemical industry and doing HAZOPs and process safety reviews, my first relationship with failing safe was, well, if that valve fails to close, what happens? Or if that valve fails to open, what happens? Or if we have high temperature, what do we want the valve to do? Do we want it to close? Do we want it to, open? Those sorts of things. And then what happens next? Does it go into a tank, or does it go into a storage area, or does it get burnt off? So that was my first sort of experience, was actually acknowledging, doesn't matter what controls we got in place, we can have all these controls in place to prevent an event happening. But we do need to realise we haven't eliminated this. So we put controls in place. Something could still, all of that could still not prevent the event. So what do we do in the case of the event? And that was sort of my first experience with that. I think it made a lot more sense to me in a process environment.
Yes.
Because you could sort of go, okay, well, if we have a leak, we've got all these testing done, we've got all this stuff done to prevent a leak, but we still might have a leak. So what do we do to when we do have a leak, right? So we've got to make sure we've got the right bunding.
Exactly.
We've got to make sure we've got all those sorts of things, showers and all that.
Yeah.
So that was my first one. So similar, bow tie, we've got all these preventative controls, but then we've got these mitigating controls. The other part of probably becoming a little bit more associated with is just the layers of control. So if you look at a bow tie, it's not just one line of controls. There's sort of 4 or 5, maybe 6 or even 10 lines of controls in preventative. So to me, I think that's another example of, if one of those controls fail, you've got other controls in place.
Yes.
And this is sort of something we've had conversations about internally around coaching leaders about response matters. If you follow HOP, response matters. So say there has been a dropped object, but the exclusion zones worked and get people out of there. And therefore then no one's been hurt. But we've had a dropped object. So we've had all these different layers of controls around drop mats, tool lanyards, exclusion zone. Now, whatever that bit up top, lanyards, drop mats, didn't work, and we ended up with a dropped object. But the exclusion zone did work. So that's just probably a little bit more day-to-day simplistic analysis.
It's a good example.
Failing safe, right? In that, well, we've got another preventative measure there, and if that's working, if it's effective, then it's going to achieve the most important thing: is we don't hurt someone.
Exactly. And another classic example, Holly, of controls and critical versus mitigation. Volvo many years ago made the statement that they were going to design vehicles so that nobody got killed. So driving a Volvo, nobody was going to get killed. So the introduction of crumple zones, the introduction of airbags, the introduction of pre-tension seat belts, all of those things was introduced, and now we have sensors on, go beep 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 and all that kind of stuff. Those are all controls, but they can still be overridden by the human being, right? Which is the unfortunate part. So we have all these controls in place, but it's not what Volvo realised was people are still having accidents in our cars, and people are still being killed, even though we have all of this technology to try and control it. And then we realised there was the human factor aspect to it. People can ignore, people can override all of these things, and sometimes that's where the bias. So have you created a situation where people are thinking, oh, I'm in a Volvo, I'm fine, I can do whatever I want? Well, it's not true. And so you always have that in the mix.
And I always think that's a really important point, right? When we say human factors, I mean, we mean humans at all stages of a process, not just the ones driving the vehicle, right? It's the human factor of the maintenance person who's maintaining the vehicle and making the checks, and it's the human factors of the Volvo manufacturing installation of so there's human factors going on through all our work. Work gets done through people, right? There's leaders who make decisions, there's engineers who make decisions, there's supervision who make decisions, and there's individuals doing the work that make decisions. And I think that's the bit I think we're slowly starting to get a little bit better at, where in that human factors has something happened And it's not about blame, it's not about fault
No.
to that, it's about understanding, well, where did something get missed in the process? And normally there was a human intervention there somewhere. I mean, a recent one I've had around this, and this is quite an interesting one, a lot of mining's going to autonomous trucks, right? So autonomous vehicles. And it was interesting. A few conversations were saying, well, now there's not going to be any HV, HV incidents. Okay, why is that? So, well, there's layers of controls built into this autonomous operation, which is amazing technology, and just it's fun. It's amazing when you see it in operation. But even there's still human factors going on in that. There's a human setting up the sensors. There's a human setting up the program. Yeah. There's a human doing the maintenance on the vehicle. There's humans actually looking at those machines operating and making decisions around acknowledging or overriding alarms. Yeah. So yes, there's a greater level of critical control going on here, but there's still an overarching human factor in all of that that I think we take for granted sometimes when we do get a greater level of control. Yeah. We feel this false sense of security and maybe accept a certain level of exposure that we may not have accepted before.
Yeah. And just go back to biases, Holly. You know, the bias. So for me, a basic definition of having biased thinking is faulty thinking. You know, you have a bias in your decision making, which means your decision making, if you're doing it in a solo situation, that your decision making is informed by your biases, and it's probably not going to be the best decision. And that's where you need this collective conversation, especially when it's critical risks and critical controls.
To wrap up, Alan, you've got a bit of an exercise that you can do with managers on site to help them ensure that their controls are effective. Yeah. Could you go through that with us?
Yeah, it's a very quick. You could run it as a little toolbox session. So I mentioned one of these isolation CCFVs. You could use that as the example and have a group of people in the room, people who actually perform the work, people who supervise the work, whoever it is, but people on site. And you can maybe get them into little groups. So the exercise initially would be, okay, on your own, of these, you wouldn't have them numbered, right? You just have this list of controls. Whether you've done this work or not, you'll be familiar with some of the controls. So what I want you to do is rank those controls in what you think is the most important and the least important. The backstory is they're all important because they're critical controls, right? And people will do that. And you'll see variation between what people, their perception, their bias, what they say is, well, that's the most important one, and that's the least important one. Then you might get them together, 2 or 3 people, and say, okay, collectively, just go through what each of you have done, and then I want you to come up with an aligned response, right? And it'll be different, right? The first 2 or 3 might be the same. Maybe it's 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, whatever it is. Then you'll ask them, so the ones you've put at the last ones, number 12, so it's okay to not have them, right? So we can take that. So if you took away number 13, would you still do the job? Would you still go ahead and do that work? And that usually when the penny drops, they'll go, well, no. And I'll say, so when you're in the workplace, that's sort of what you're doing. I'm not asking you to do it, but you're looking at the job setup, and there might be that control that you think in your bias has informed you, well, it's not that important, really. I don't need to have that sign if that's a critical control. It's a poor example. But I don't need to have that. It'll be okay because I've got the top 3 or whatever it is. And that's the reality. That's actually what happens when you're in the field doing the work, unless you're totally aware of all 13. And if there's only 12, you've got a decision to make. Do I carry on or not? And sometimes I'll do the job and it's been okay. I don't need 13. I only need 12.
Yeah. I really like the activity of that because I mean, it does a couple of things. And I think one is it does give us an understanding of how people perceive or have biases towards all the controls we're asking them to use. But for the listeners out there to do that with your teams and those sorts of things, it also gives you a sense of, well, when you go out and you look at work and you see controls aren't in place, but people have still chosen to continue with the work, this starts to give you a bit of an insight to why that is, because they're looking, there's 12 controls, we've got 10 of them in place, and in their mind, they've got the 10 most important ones of that list. Couldn't get these two set up today, so it's probably okay. Now, we all know, well, no, you need all 10 or you need all 12, whatever it is. But it opens up a conversation around what do people really think about these controls, what are the decisions people are making, what are the biases people have towards them. So thank you, Alan. I think that's a really good, simple activity to do for people to open up those conversations beyond just make sure your controls are in place.
And it's really, really interesting when you run it, because you take it so far and they all go,
ooh,
okay, got it.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Alan, and thank you again for joining us on the Fatality Free Future podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. I really enjoyed that conversation. I still think in this whole process of SIF prevention, critical controls to me and the effectiveness of them is still the part that I think we can make a huge step change.
Huge. I agree, John. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fatality Free Future podcast. Head to our Fatality Free Future Hub on barclays.com for more information and to access everything we spoke about in this episode.